Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the choices in some of our favorite games and figure out which decision is the right one. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're diving back into Telltale Games' The Walking Dead Season 2, plowing our way through the snow-covered season finale. In case you missed Season 1 or any of the other previous episodes, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down the series, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. Episode 5 is titled No Going Back, and that title isn't just hyperbole. The end of the previous episode was a cliffhanger for the ages, as Rebecca passed away and reanimated within moments while holding her new baby in her arms as chaos erupted in the form of a standoff between our group and a group that includes Arvo, the man Clementine and Jane stole supplies from. As the groups yell back and forth, each demanding the other drop their guns, Clementine notices zombie Rebecca coming to and fires a single round to save the baby. As that shot echoes through the countryside, a battle gets underway, with Clementine making a mad scramble for the infant, who's now laying in the middle of the snow-covered road. Arvo is desperately trying to save his sister, who is hit by someone when the gunfire started. But as Kenny grabs the young man as a hostage, she reanimates and starts coming after Clem and the crying baby. Clementine takes out the second zombie just as easily as she took out the first, and the fight comes to an end as the final member of the gang is silenced by a returning Jane. As they are reunited, Jane expresses remorse for killing the man, saying she'd never killed someone who didn't wrong her in some way or deserve it. It could be argued the man did deserve it. After all, he was shooting the group and would have killed any one of them without a second thought. But we can also examine the situation as a whole and question that assumption pretty easily. The first shot, in this instance, was Clementine firing at Rebecca to save the baby. The firefight that ensued was mainly due to the tension running high as both groups were unwilling to compromise in any way. Yes, Clementine stole the medicine from Arvo, which could have led to the anger and even a desire to get even from him and his group. But the reality of the situation is that it could have easily been resolved if not for the egos of everyone involved. If, instead of popping out of the woods and aiming their guns, the group had explained the situation and opened a dialogue, they might have been able to work something out without the need for bloodshed. That would have required some careful diplomacy, and for people like Kenny and Luke to keep level heads, but it would have been possible. It's a lesson that we can take away for our own lives, which is kind of the point of the series to begin with. I realized recently that we haven't really talked a lot about philosophy in general, as we've spent the past 10 weeks now looking at this game from a philosophical and ethical standpoint. Often, I spend some time breaking down a character and their actions, but I don't really explain why those things matter outside of the context of the game. Philosophy is all about finding the right question to ask, digging in and uncovering the why of our actions and figuring out how we ought to do things in regards to everyday choices. Often, we can look back at things we did or said and dissect those situations to improve in the future. But sometimes, the nature of humanity is best uncovered using thought experiments. Games allow us to peek into our own inner workings through the choices and scenarios they present. We can ask ourselves why we decided to do something like save Sarah, or leave Lily on the side of the road less than a week after trying to save her father despite how he had treated us. And the answers give us a peek into how our own minds work. Maybe you normally try to do the right thing in your personal life, but you want to see how making less moral choices feels in an environment where the worst outcome is a game over screen. Maybe you just inherently want the best possible outcome for everyone in the game. By taking the time to figure out why we choose one option or another, we can learn more about ourselves and find ways to not only improve individually, but also improve the world around us. We'll expand more on the topic in future videos, but I wanted to address it here on a high level because my goal with this series is not just to break down the choices in worlds of games, but to use those things to explore topics and concepts that can normally be really dry and boring in a way that makes them a little more fun. Getting back with our group, there's a discussion about what to do with Arvo that includes Kenny wanting to just shoot him, while Luke and Mike argue to keep him alive. Arvo, for his part, says he has a house with supplies not far away, and offers to lead the group to it if they let him live. While Kenny doesn't trust him, Bonnie and the others think it's worth a shot. Jane makes the best argument, saying that it is less about trusting him and more about taking any shot that they can get to get supplies. Thinking about it logically, Jane is right. The best thing to do is let him lead the group to where he says the supplies are hidden. They can be careful about it, observing and being stealthy, and if the supplies exist, then great. If not, they can get rid of Arvo later. As they walk, Jane apologizes to Clem for leaving, and promises to not do it again. She seems genuinely sorry and even shows a bit of character growth in the form of some positivity about the group in general. Some of this seems to be centered on her view of Clementine more than anything else, but it's a step in the direction of being willing to give being in a group a try. At the same time, she points out again that Kenny might be unstable, trying to undermine him in Clementine's mind. On the one hand, he has been through a lot, but he's also shown a lot of resilience that few in his situation probably would. He's lost several people that he cares deeply about, but he's also bounced back and found a new purpose each time. After a brief stop to rest, where Clem helps Luke deal with guilt over how bad things have gotten before cleaning Kenny's eye up, the group finds themselves approaching a power substation as the sun is going down. They've been walking for hours, and Arvo says they've got a while before they reach the supposed safe house, so they decide to spend the night in the relative safety of the substation. But there's more to these scenes than just the surface level of walking from point A to point B. For instance, when Clementine and Luke are talking, he reveals a level of guilt that rarely shows through. It's a great moment for bonding and character development, but it's also a teachable moment. As Bonnie walks over and Luke tries to pretend he and Clem weren't just talking about something as deep as survivor's guilt. As Clem, you can clue Bonnie in on what was just said, but Luke gets upset with you as he didn't want Bonnie to know what was going on. This is a very common problem that a lot of people deal with after experiencing trauma. It can be hard to open up to anyone, and even if you are able to open up to someone, it's usually something that you don't want to share with others outside of the person you opened up to. But this thinking is also counter to what you need to heal. And healing after trauma would be even more important in the zombie apocalypse than it is even today. Any one person can only carry so much emotional baggage before they reach their limit, and sharing it with others can help immensely. I'm speaking from experience on this front. I spent a few years in the Army, and in 2011 I deployed to Iraq for a tour that included a lot of things I wasn't prepared for. One of the things I had to deal with when I got back was PTSD and survivor's guilt, as I served alongside several friends that never made it home. I didn't even realize what all I was dealing with until I was able to talk with a specialist later on, but one thing that helped me before even then was sharing my experience with my wife. A lot of guys I served with refused to talk about things with anyone, using the excuse that no one else could possibly understand them. But that is actually more about hubris than anything else. Opening up and sharing things with others not only helps you heal, but it builds trust. If, instead of trying to hold everything inside, Luke and even Kenny would share what they've got going on, the group would actually function a lot better. Everyone would be able to understand them, they would be able to understand each other, and they would know that they aren't alone in feeling what they're feeling. Bonnie even tries to reassure Luke before he brushes it off and Clem goes to help Kenny. Then, later on, as they are all sitting around a fire at the substation, there's another chance for group building, and you find out that it's Luke's birthday, before Bonnie breaks out a bottle of alcohol to pass around. Kenny walks off, saying he's going to guard the perimeter, when Luke makes a toast in remembrance of those they've lost. And it's the slowdown in the pacing that really makes the episode great. I want to refer back to something I said in the last episode. The Walking Dead at its core is a story about human resilience, about overcoming obstacles and finding our humanity when all seems lost. The fast-paced running from zombies, going from place to place, escaping from other groups, wouldn't actually make up a majority of the time for the survivors. Those things only take center stage in a video game because without some action, the majority of people would tune out and stop playing. And knowing about your fellow survivors, sharing things like we talked about before, would go a long way to building cohesion in the group. The more familiar you are with each other, the more likely you are to want to look out for them and trust them to look out for you. And having that group, as we also discussed in episode 4, is an overall benefit to the people in it for the social and emotional needs it fulfills. It's the little things like learning that Luke was an art history major, seeing the attempt of an adult discussion while trying to shield Clem from the details, learning that Jane broke into her parents' liquor cabinet and ate glass shards, and hearing Kenny talk about how much he regrets spending time on his boat instead of spending time with Katja and Duck, that really helps build the characters and make them feel more real. And, even though the peace in the group doesn't last, the calm is enough to remind everyone about the difference between surviving and living, as they spend a few minutes laughing about Luke and Jane's hookup. The morning light finds the group back on the road, and things are back to being tense as Luke struggles to keep up and Kenny keeps harassing Arvo. Coming into a clearing, Arvo points out the house he's been leading them to. It's a half-built mess sitting on the other side of what would normally be a decent-sized body of water. Arvo insists that you can walk across the ice, and after a fair bit of back and forth, they decide to have him lead the way as the rest of the group follows slowly. I'll point out here that following him wasn't the best idea, as there was likely no way the water had enough time to freeze over thick enough for people to safely walk on. But there isn't really any other option. For a body of water to be safe to walk on, you need temperatures well below the freezing mark for at least 2 to 3 weeks to ensure the ice is thick enough. Arvo acts like he's walked across the ice before, but given what we've seen so far, it's unlikely the water was frozen the last time he was at the house. It took roughly a day and a half to reach the building, and the first time Clem saw Arvo was about 2 to 3 days prior to the group arriving there. It's all speculation, but at a minimum, the last time he was even at the house was likely at least 4 to 5 days before he returned with the group. The air temperature has obviously been cold, but given how long they've been outside and the fact that none of them are frostbitten, it's unlikely the temperature has gone much below freezing. And that is only a recent thing, not something that's been going on for 2+ weeks. That point aside, they follow him across the ice, but it isn't without incident as Luke falls through a weak point and finds himself barely clinging onto the surface. To make matters worse, a group of zombies is making their way onto the ice behind the group, and Luke only has a short amount of time to get out of the water before being eaten. He asks Clem and Bonnie to help him by taking out the zombies as he works to pull himself out, and we're transported back to when Bonnie, Mike, and Clem were in the museum, and Bonnie said to Clem,
"I'm sorry I asked you. I won't do it again."
Bonnie insists Clem is small enough to help Luke without falling in, and you have a choice to either go and help him or shoot the zombies. While the urge to try and save him is strong, the best thing to do is cover him while he escapes on his own. The ice isn't thick enough for his weight, let alone any additional weight. Bonnie doesn't want to accept that though, and she races over to try and help, causing the ice to break and plunging them both into the cold water. Luke makes an attempt to surface, smacking the ice from below, and Clem has one more opportunity to try and save him, but it requires her to punch a hole in the ice, which would likely plunge her into the water as well. And this is where all the practice of dealing with the hard decisions has come back to help Clementine make the call. We could go back to when she was trying to convince Sarah to get up as zombies were trying to break down the door. Or maybe to when she likely heard from Krista and Omid about how Kenny jumped down to save Krista. But how high does the risk to yourself have to be before you walk away and let someone die when your actions might have saved them? In a split second, you don't have time to make those calculations. You have to be quick. Thankfully, we have time to think it through here. Cold water isn't like zombies. While you could fight off or even block the dead with enough know-how, you can't control how your body reacts when it hits that icy liquid. If it isn't something that you're used to, or at least something you're prepared for, the cold could send your body into shock in an instant. Once that happens, you're not only unable to help the person you went in after, but now you also need to be rescued. Maybe Luke could have been saved if Bonnie hadn't gone after him, if they'd had some rope to throw him while pulling him up from a safe area. But the moment he went under, it was over. Even if they were able to get him out, the risk of hypothermia would skyrocket, and without a way to warm him up and stabilize his core temperature, he would be dead in a matter of minutes. In this situation, you have to leave Luke. Getting into the house, Kenny is irate with Arvo, who he blames for putting them in the situation that caused Luke and Bonnie's deaths, and everyone else is in a state of shock. Jane manages to find a couple of duffel bags of canned chili, showing that Arvo wasn't completely lying about having supplies, but that food isn't going to solve all of their problems, and before long, Kenny is working on getting a pickup truck that he finds outside working, in the hopes of continuing north to look for Wellington. And this is where Jane and Kenny really start to get at each other. Kenny gets a little more hands-on with Arvo than he probably should, and Jane starts looking for ways to fire Kenny up. Let's take a step back though, because we're really getting into the deepest part of the episode. The night before, around the campfire, Jane was starting to open up a bit, and even seemed to be warming up to the idea of being in a group. She'd come back after leaving the first time, mostly because of Clementine, but also because she was starting to feel like a part of something, and because of her connection with Luke. There may have even been a budding romance there, with the limited options in the world probably contributing to that. Less than 24 hours later, Luke goes into the water with Bonnie, and neither one comes back up. In one foul swoop, Jane not only lost someone she'd started to draw closer to, but she also realized he and Bonnie were closer than she considered. Because of that, she went back into the safe place in her mind where being in a group is bad and her instincts kick in. The only reason she didn't leave right then and there was because of Clementine, who she saw as a surrogate little sister. At that point, Jane decided that the best course of action would be to drive a wedge between Clementine and Kenny, who she knew were close, by finding ways to get under his skin and pointing out to Clem every mistake that he made as an example of his unraveling. Kenny makes this even easier as his brash actions and anger issues provide plenty of fodder for Jane's cannon. And the dire situation in the house just makes things worse. Throughout all of this, Mike is warming up to Arvo, and the two are making their own plans in the background. The group is falling apart, and it's becoming more and more clear that Clem is going to have to make a choice. Kenny gets one of the trucks behind the building working, with Mike and Jane coming out to argue with him about where they should take it, before they all decide to wait for morning light to leave. Kenny isn't happy with waiting, but Clementine is able to calm him down as they sit in the truck and have a conversation about everything from what Lee might say in the situation to whether Wellington is even real. At one point in the conversation, Kenny brings up how he felt about Clementine choosing to sit with Luke and his group back in the lodge. He says it made him feel sad, but he also felt incredibly proud of Clem as her choice to sit with them showed just how much she was growing up. And this conversation in general reveals a more sentimental side to Kenny that is going to be really great to dive into in his Friend or Foe episode. It shows how much even the smallest things have an impact on him, for better or worse. It also shows how his outlook, even with all the bad things that have happened, is still one of hope. He chose to be proud of Clementine rather than hold a grudge against her. He chooses to hope that someone out there has managed to make something work. He's ready to move forward and do what's right for Clementine and AJ, despite everything that's happened. Leaving the truck, the pair heads inside with the rest of the group to try and rest. But Clementine finds herself waking up at some point in the night to the sound of something hitting outside the window. A cord is blowing in the wind, smacking up against the house. But as she goes outside to remedy the issue, she finds Mike and Arvo in the process of stealing the truck. Mike is trying to keep things calm, but Arvo's been waiting to get back at Clementine ever since she stole his bag, and he winds up shooting her as Kenny and Jane come running out to see what's going on. As the screen goes black, Kenny's voice fades further and further into the distance. But it isn't Kenny's voice anymore, it's Lee. He's waking Clementine up as they ride in the RV, telling her that she was just having a bad dream. I'm going to be completely honest here and say that the first time I played this episode, a part of me was hoping that Lee was telling the truth. Maybe the whole thing had been a dream, and we'd get the chance to play as Clementine, but Lee wouldn't get bit this time and things would work out better. Alas, that was just as much of a dream. The sequence itself, at least in my head, is Clementine reliving a conversation we didn't get to see from Season 1. It's also a way for her to process everything that's happened and work through things in her own way. After a brief talk, she falls asleep leaning against Lee before waking up to find herself in a different moving vehicle. Kenny is driving and Jane is trying to spot for him as snow is falling outside. After shooting Clem, Mike and Arvo took off into the woods. Kenny and Jane checked on her before loading her and AJ into the truck, leaving before anyone else could try to steal it. As they barrel down the freeway, Kenny and Jane argue about where they should go, and Jane spends a considerable amount of time riling Kenny up. Just as the arguing is hitting a crescendo, a pileup of cars ahead of them in the snow gets Kenny's attention, and he slams on the brakes, somehow avoiding hitting anything as the truck finally comes to a stop. The first thing Kenny does is check that everyone, including Jane, is alright. Jane wants to keep moving, but Kenny is worried about the fuel situation and decides to go check and see if he can find a vehicle that might have some diesel left in the tank. Climbing out, he tells them to meet him at a nearby rest stop if anything goes wrong, and disappears into the snowstorm. Jane tries to talk Clem into leaving, but they are interrupted by the sound of gunfire before zombies start making their way out of the pileup. Jane starts the truck and tells Clem to hit the gas, but that only helps them get a short way before the truck is stuck in a ditch. Jane gets out of the truck, leaving Clem behind and running into the storm with AJ. After escaping herself, Clem wanders through the storm for a bit before finally finding the rest stop with a worried Kenny inside. Kenny is frustrated that Jane took AJ, but that frustration turns to panic as Jane finally shows up without the baby. She isn't clear on what happened, and before long, Kenny is going back out to look for him. As he runs out, Jane pulls Clementine aside and tells her to just sit back and ignore whatever happens. She refuses to say anything else, and as Kenny runs back in, it's clear he thinks the worst has happened. The two wind up fighting, and things get really bad before Kenny finally gets the upper hand. He's on top of her, trying to force a knife into her, and Clementine has the option to shoot Kenny or let him stab her. But what's the right thing to do? The truth is, this is one of the most complicated decisions of the season, because the final outcome, how each character acts, depends heavily on the choices Clementine has made throughout the season, and even reaches back into Season 1 with how Lee got along with Kenny. On the surface, Jane makes some good points about Kenny and his anger issues. He is quick to jump to conclusions, makes unilateral decisions, and seems to hate anyone that doesn't want to go along with him in every situation. But he's also shown himself to be very loyal to those he considers family, and is willing to put the needs of the group first even when he isn't happy with the other members. Jane, on the other hand, has got a lot going on herself, and is just as dangerous in her own way. She started to collapse internally since Luke died, using that instance as confirmation of her opinion that being with a group brings nothing but pain. It's a state of mind she's not even aware of, but does it warrant her death? To complicate matters, we don't know in the moment what happened to AJ. The only information we have is that Kenny went out and came back as if he found something, and we're left to wonder what she could have done. Could she be capable of causing AJ's death? With the given information, letting Kenny win makes the most sense. Even if we've disagreed with him, gone against him, and think he's unhinged. For one thing, Jane told us not to intervene. For another, neither of them needs to really die, and by shooting Kenny, we would become an active participant rather than a passive bystander. It's also worth pointing out how shifty Jane was when Kenny was looking for AJ. She won't say anything about the baby's whereabouts, and even goes as far as saying,
You have to trust me. You're gonna see what he really is.
while telling Clem to stay out of things. The only context where that makes sense is if she did something really bad in another attempt to rile Kenny up and push him over the edge. After stabbing Jane, Kenny's main concern is that AJ is gone. He seems to be in complete disbelief about the whole thing, but that only lasts a short while as the cry of an infant carries over the sound of the wind and snow. Making their way to a nearby car, they find AJ safe and sound in the back seat, and it becomes clear what happened. Jane hid the baby and then hinted that he was dead, just to push Kenny to his breaking point. She could have, at any time before things got out of hand, told him AJ was alright, but she chose to allow the fight to continue. Not only that, she knew what all Kenny had been through with Katja and Duck and then Sarita, and how important family and the baby was to him, and she still thought that pretending AJ was gone was the right thing to do, all to prove a point while trying to manipulate Clementine. Even through all of that, you have another choice to make. Do you stay with Kenny or go it alone? Kenny hasn't shown himself to be a danger to Clementine or AJ. In fact, he's shown that he's willing to kill to protect them. Because of that, it makes the most sense to stick with him. But that isn't the end of things either. 9 days later, we find a tired Kenny carrying AJ and walking alongside Clementine as they approach a pillar of smoke rising just above a hill. Racing up the slope, they find themselves face to face with a large wall, and the spark of hope they've been holding on to grows. But as they walk up, a gunshot rings out and a bullet hits the ground at their feet. A voice tells them to hold and drop their weapons before asking them to approach the gate. A woman standing guard confirms they've reached Wellington, but as she drops a bag of supplies, she informs them that the community is full. In a moment that shows Kenny's true character, he steps up and begs the woman to just take the kids. He's willing to walk away, but he needs them to be safe. After a few moments, the woman says she'll go ask someone and walks away as Clem questions Kenny, and he insists that her and AJ need to stay there. And staying is the right call, but the reason for that is better suited to Kenny's upcoming Friend or Foe episode. I've mentioned it a couple of times and it's coming in a few days. I wanted to wait until Kenny's story had ended to dive into him as a person and character, and this episode is the end of his tale, no matter which choices you made. And I'm curious to hear what choices you did make in the comments down below. Did you wind up with Kenny or Jane, or were you alone? Did you make it to Wellington, or did you end up going somewhere else? Next week, we're going to be starting on Season 3, and we'll be finding out whether Kenny is a friend or foe. We'll also be diving into Jane's story in another Friend or Foe episode that you're not going to want to miss. The best way to keep up with everything is to subscribe to the channel, and liking the video is always appreciated as well. If you want early access and info on projects and other things before they come out, you can join as a channel member or head over to Patreon, where I've got a ton of stuff to check out. That's all I've got for now. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
When he's old enough, you make him wear it. It'll keep the sun out of his eyes. That's important. All right. Good. Keep an eye out for him. Please. Now, you take care of Alvin here. You live a good life, okay? Don't waste this, okay? Now, I'm gonna go before one of us changes their mind. Now, I'm gonna walk away, and I might not look back. Not because I don't want to. I'm real glad to have met you, Clementine.